Hey everybody, how's it going? So today I wanted to talk about a game that has recently become a huge obsession of mine, which is Into the Breach from developer Subset Games, the guys who brought FTL Faster Than Light. And this game is a completely different style of game, very retro in its appearance, but the whole premise is you are playing as different squads of mechs fighting off what is essentially a giant alien bug invasion. And this is a game that feels like it was made for me. This is a game that feels like it was just placed directly into my lap, and the developer said, "Here you go. This is all yours," because it's got the retro style I love, turn-based strategy, which I find so compelling and so fun. And then it's got giant robots, giant monsters, which is always a classic combination. And before I go into talking about each of the squads and how they play and how they feel, I just want to talk about the gameplay as a whole. The impression I've got it from my obsessive amounts of playtime is that this is a game that punishes aggression on normal and hard difficulties, and even occasionally on easy difficulty. If you make aggressive moves and you try to stay on the offensive and get ahead of the enemy, then they overwhelm, they move past your mechs, they corner you, they back you into spaces that you can't get out of, and you end up suffering more damage than you're supposed to. So the idea is to go into the gameplay as a whole knowing that you're fighting a game on the defensive and you're fighting as people that are losing. So your goal isn't necessarily to beat every enemy on the battlefield every time. Your goal is to beat as many as possible while minimizing every single bit of damage you can, because you have a global health bar. Any damage you take from the first island of the game can carry on and affect your ability to play all the way up until the final island of the game. So minimizing damage, minimizing punishment, and keeping as many rewards as you can is vital to the strategy in this game. So without any further ado, let's start taking a look at the 8 squads. Into the Breach has a total of 9 squads, 8 of which are easily unlocked with the first sets of achievements you can earn. The 9th one is unlocked only by completing every single one of the achievements, earning every single coin the achievements give you, and then purchasing it as a basically end game reward. I won't be taking a look at the secret squad today, but I will be looking at the other base game squads, starting out with the Riftwalkers. The Riftwalkers are your basic vanilla start of the game mechs. They're the first ones you have. They're balanced enough that they can carry you through till the end of the game. They're usable in almost any scenario. They have the combat mech, the cannon mech, and the artillery mech. The combat mech is your kind of Pacific Rim style looking humanoid mech that throws heavy punches, dealing big damage, pushing opponents away. The cannon mech is a large tank that rolls through, fires a cannon that also pushes opponents away. And then the artillery mech sits at a solid distance and is just good for picking at and pushing away opposing Vec monsters. So this squad I found to be, as I already said, incredibly well balanced. They play very smoothly, they work really well with each other, and they're just a good squad really to get the feel for how the game should be played. They're not really the best squad, and they're not necessarily the most strategic. You don't need a lot of creative strategy to do well with them, but they're not so simple that they're boring to play as. There's a lot of situations that they can easily be overwhelmed in, and there's a lot of situations where that they wind up in where they'll end up sacrificing one mech's turn to rescue another, or you'll be having to compensate for a little bit of aggression by backing off and playing defensive. I found when I play as them, I tend to be far more aggressive because they have an entirely offensive based moveset. Every single one of them does damage. Every single one of them has the ability to maneuver and push opponents away. And so the key with these guys is, especially starting out, to keep yourself balanced, to remind yourself to play on the defensive, and to note that doing damage is not the most important thing onto the planet. The second squad in the game is the Rusting Hulks, a much more strategic squad than the Riftwalkers. These guys rely heavily on the use of electric smoke clouds to prevent attacks and damage their opponents. Unlike the Riftwalkers, where they could play much more aggressively, go all in, and start pushing Vec out of the way, the Rusting Hulks do not. Their 3 mechs are the Jet Mech, the Rocket Mech, and the Pulse Mech. The jet mech makes its attacks by flying over opponents, dropping a bomb, doing damage, and leaving a smoke cloud. The rocket mech fires a rocket and leaves an active smoke cloud behind it. Both of these, which when enemies wind up in it, prevent their attacks and do damage for every turn they're in it. Then there's the pulse mech, a mech that moves and literally does no damage and just pushes opponents away. These guys do not favor heavily aggressive playstyles, but I've found that it's better to be in the mix with them. So not staying at a distance and picking off enemies from far away. You need to be defensively aggressive, being careful in your strategies and your placement, but leaving as many smoke clouds behind as you can to use the pulse mech to push Vec into them and just keep them away from cities and constantly being damaged. The best strategy for this is to almost cover the battlefield in electric smoke and then use the pulse mech and the rocket mech to push and manipulate Vec into those spaces. That's the way you're going to see these guys succeed. They're not terribly hard to play as. I've never had a terribly difficult time, but I've found that when I make mistakes with them, I'm punished way more heavily than when I'm using a much more aggressive and more damage dealing squad. So these guys, you don't want to put the focus on necessarily outright damage, but you want to put the focus on covering the battlefield in smoke and manipulating the enemy to where you want them to be. So the third squad in the game is the Zenith Guard, using the laser mech, the charge mech, and the defense mech. The laser mech looks a lot like Metal Gear Rex, fires a giant beam across the battlefield, dealing big damage. The charge mech hits hard, it's a big truck, pushes the enemy, takes and deals an equal amount of damage. And then the defense mech, which pulls enemies closer to itself by one tile and covers two obstacles at the same time with a shield. These guys I've found are really, really strategic. Placing them in the wrong spot, even at the beginning of a round, can absolutely cost you the battle. If you don't have the laser mech or the charge mech lined up in the right space, you're not going to get a proper attack in, you're not going to deal the damage or push the opponents out of the way that you need. If your defense mech is way in the wrong spot, you have no defensive coverage, there's no safe enemy manipulation. These guys do okay damage, they're really, really not balanced in an aggressive playstyle, so I do not gel well with this squad at all. I tend to be more aggressive, I tend to push harder, which kind of hurts playstyles like these where they really, really are key for defensive players. If you really feel comfortable with strategy and you really feel comfortable with placing your guys well in line with enemies and kind of manipulating those attacks better and creating better turn coordination, these guys are an effective team to use when used well. But if you tend to be a more aggressive player like me, these guys are not beneficial. I tend to lose way more often with the Zenith Guard than I do with probably a lot of the other squads in this game. Fourth squad in the game is the Blitzkrieg squad. Now this is the squad that I found to be really where the mechs start to feel super, super interesting. Not that any of the ones before this have been bland, but they're almost expected. Like you see mechs in the designs of trucks and giant walking fists and artillery cannons, and you look at it and it makes sense. And this is really where I think the creativity of some of these designs starts to shine through with the lightning mech, the hook mech, and the boulder mech. The lightning mech is another humanoid shaped one that wields a lightning whip that actually chains through opponents and can be upgraded to chain through obstacles. The hook mech, which is a heavily armored mech, meaning it doesn't take certain types of damage, that literally uses a grappling hook to either pull itself across the battlefield or pull enemies right into itself. Unfortunately, this one doesn't deal damage like some of the other ones do. And then there's the boulder mech, one in the style of the artillery and the rocket mech, but it fires a large boulder that either breaks on opponents and can push surrounding tiles, or it can be used to literally drop rocks in the middle of a battlefield, blocking off cities, blocking off spawning enemy points. This is a really, really creative squad. It's a really interesting squad. They can be, when placed wrong, just like the Zenith Guard, their placement at the beginning or even in the middle of the battlefield can get you crushed. But properly pushing enemies together and blocking off spawn points can be really good for minimizing the amount of Vec that show up on the battlefield. And creative use of the lightning mech can devastate multiple enemies at the same time. Even the upgrade that lets you chain through buildings lets you hit through a safe space, putting your guys at less risk. These guys, their strategy favors really, I would say, a little bit more of an aggressive playstyle. You got to be willing to push in. You got to be willing to go for the spawn blocks. You got to be willing to place your mechs in the right spots to get Vec out of the way, to get your guys in the way. The Blitzkrieg really do favor a bit more of a rushed playstyle. Not hyper rushed, but pushing in, being aggressive, going after the enemy, putting them in the spots you want them. Don't wait for the enemy to come to you with this team. You want to go in and be the first one to be making the attacks and putting the enemy at a disadvantage, which I know in a game that favors a more defensive playstyle can be trickier, but with these guys, for me at least, it tends to work when I'm willing to commit and be willing to take a little bit of damage on the side of my mechs to keep my buildings and my other constructs safe to get the rewards. Number 5 on the list is the Steel Judoka. These guys are an incredibly fun squad. I've talked about how some of the squads rely on more careful enemy placement than anything else. This squad relies entirely on enemy placement with the Judo Mech, the Siege Mech, and the Gravity Mech. The Judo Mech is a mech that grabs enemies and throws them behind it. The Siege Mech is an artillery style mech that fires rockets and only pushes opponents away. It does no damage initially. And the Gravity Mech, which fires a gravity well which sucks opponents closer to it by 1 tile. And so getting the Vec to attack each other in this squad is crucial. There's really only one mech that deals damage from its base attack alone, that being the Judo Mech. The Siege Mech and the Gravity Mech are great for pushing opponents away from their targets and then using their attacks to hit other Vec and to damage the enemy. They actually have a bonus for this that allows Vec to do extra damage against each other. So taking things like the Siege Mech, using the rockets to push a Vec into the path of another one, so that not only are you blocking a city, that Vec is now gonna take an extra hit. It's gonna take more damage. Really turning the enemy against each other is the entire name of the game with this one, which can be difficult. These guys do favor a little bit of aggression, not a ton, mostly with the Judo Mech. The other two require patience and really, really calculated moves in order to get the Vec into just the right spots. If you manipulate even one Vec into the slightly wrong place and the attack order doesn't go the way you want, instead of losing an enemy, you now have potentially lost a city or a power plant or another reward. So with these guys, strategy is key, but you can afford to be a little bit more reckless and aggressive, at least with a third of the squad, but they do require a decent amount of calculated effort to really shine and to really get a feel for how they play. But once you get the hang of how they feel, once you get really going with manipulating enemies, getting the placement just right, and seeing just enemies chain into and attack each other feels so satisfying with the squad like this one. Moving on to squad number 6, it brings us to the Flame Behemoths. These guys are a very interesting squad to use in that they don't do really any damage right at the start. Most of their damage comes middle to late round. But you have the Flame Mech, the Meteor Mech, and the Swap Mech for this team. So the Flame Mech, another humanoid looking one, has dual flamethrowers that set fire to and push the opponent, as well as setting fire to the tiles. There's the Meteor Mech, an artillery style mech that launches a rocket, lights the tile on fire, and pushes opposing tiles out of the way. And the Swap Mech, which is a teleporter that basically lets you switch places with an enemy onto the battlefield. And these guys have the advantage of being immune to fire, which is fantastic, but none of their damage is put in right away, so they deal bonus damage against opponents that are on fire. But the best strategy I found with these guys is to move quickly and cover as much of the ground in flames as possible. So using the Flame Mech and the Meteor Mech to light as many tiles on fire as possible, using the Swap Mech to push opponents into the fire is a great strategy, and be aggressive in that fashion, and then utilizing the Flame Mech to really just push opponents into the fire or deal the big damage once they are on fire. These guys can be risky in that if you get too aggressive, you maybe haven't either lit enough enemies on fire or there's not enough flame coverage on the battlefield to really do significant damage. And even while the enemies are on fire, they take 1 damage per turn, so if you're not careful with your placement and your manipulation of enemies, they can still do big damage to your cities and your structures and take out your global health bar before really the battle is over and before they go down. So be aggressive, light as much of the battlefield on fire as you can, push enemies into it, and kind of have fun really playing a scorched earth operation. But just be careful in that you don't lose track of where some of the big damaging enemies are, especially late in the game with all of your upgrades. I find I tend to get a little cocky with these guys, and I don't watch the enemy placements as much, and I end up doing more damage to myself and my own things I'm trying to protect than any of the enemies I'm trying to fight, and it has cost me games on these guys. Squad number 7 is the Frozen Titans. This is a squad that, again, like the Zenith Guard, I struggle with strategically. They have the Aegis Mech, the Mirror Mech, and the Ice Mech. The Aegis Mech is another humanoid mech with a shield that strikes opponents and flips their attack the other way. The Mirror Mech is like the Cannon Mech, but it shoots two opposite directions. And then there's the Ice Mech, which kind of operates like the Boulder Mech and fires a giant block of ice that freezes the opponent and itself. This is a squad that, again, I think really heavily relies less so on enemy placement and more so on your careful positions at the start of and in the middle of battle. The Aegis Mech is great for being aggressive and then flipping enemies into different spots, but I struggle with placement with the Mirror Mech and the Ice Mech. I never get the full effect of the Ice Mech. I'm always breaking myself out half the time because it freezes itself and I feel like I'm wasting actions, and with the Mirror Mech, I feel like I can never get it into the right spot so I can get it into the right positions where I'm dealing enough damage to make it feel viable. But a lot of that comes down to my play style. I tend to be aggressive and I push where I shouldn't, and I tend to kind of go for strategies that don't exactly work with the right squad. So my feel for these guys and not liking them as much does kind of come from my own personal play style. I'm not great at being defensive as I should be, especially with squads like this. But these guys, much like any of the other squads, if you feel you can be really calculated and creative with your decision making and you can find the best avenues and the spots and take advantage of their movement tiles, you can really, really rack up big damage, and you can definitely spend most of your time freezing opponents, breaking them out of ice, pushing opponents into the right spots to deal big damage, and causing the Vec to waste just as many turns and actions on protecting themselves as you have to with protecting your cities. You can also kind of use the Ice Mech to shield your cities by covering them in ice, which, while not great, is a good rudimentary last-second bit of defense. So these guys, much like the Zenith Guard, require a lot more careful placement with your own guys and less so with enemy manipulation. But once you really get rolling with them, they feel super great to play and real strong out there on each of the islands. The last squad I'll be taking a look at in this video is the Hazardous Mechs. These guys are, honestly, I think my favorite squad in the entirety of the game. So they have the Leap Mech, the Unstable Mech, and the Nano Mech. The Leap Mech is a giant jumping mech that deals damage and pushes opponents out of the way. The Unstable Mech is a cannon that deals damage and pushes opponents away as well as itself, and the Nano Mech is a flying mech that shoots acid and allows enemies to take more damage. And the key with both the Leap and the Unstable Mech is they both do and take damage, but the team also has a passive bonus of they recover damage on any kill shots. So while you might take damage yourself when using the Leap Mech, if you defeat a Vec, you gain that health immediately back. So these guys really favor much more aggressive play styles. You want to be crushing as many Vec as possible. You want to be bouncing all over the battlefield, coating as many guys in acid as possible. Really kind of in the feel of the Riftwalkers. Covering the battlefield is advantageous for these guys. They have great move sets, they deal big damage, and if you can manipulate yourself just right and you can play with just the right tinge of aggression, you don't put your mechs at that great of risk. They deal just as much damage and they recover all the ones they would suffer. I find that really pushing hard with an aggressive play style is the best with these guys, but you've got to be careful. Pushing the enemies in the wrong position can either get result in you taking more than one hit each round, which can get your mechs crippled, and playing too recklessly can push enemies into the paths of cities and other bonus objectives, which would then cause you to lose out on valuable rewards. So as tempting as these guys can be to really ramp up the aggression, to be bouncing all over the battlefield and just dealing out big numbers of damage, you really got to watch yourself and how you play, because if you become too aggressive, you become too reckless, at which point then the battle starts to turn and you begin to lose. That's where these guys can kind of be disadvantageous, is really just if you're not careful with your placement. You jump into the wrong spot, push yourself into the wrong path, or hit the wrong target at the wrong time, and the battle swings completely in the opposite direction, and now you're struggling to keep your guys alive while also do damage, and you just become overrun and you suffer. So I really personally love the Hazardous Mechs. I think they are one of my favorite squads in this entire game, but if I'm not careful with them, and if I ramp up the aggression way too hard, I lose like within the first few minutes of a game. They don't require as calculated of strategy, but you gotta at least dial back and slow your pace. I guess calculated aggression would be the best way to describe the way these guys feel. You've just got to be careful with how you place yourselves and the amount of damage you're willing to take in order to knock out some of the bigger, tougher bad guys. And that wraps out the list. So I know I didn't take a super in-depth, serious look at how they each play mechanically, or really the deep specifics of it. I can always upload more videos exploring each team more specifically, or exploring mechanics in a greater level. But I hope this was just informative, or even helpful on some level to how the game plays, or how each of the squads feel, or even just getting other people's opinions on what they think of this game. I love it. This thing eats so many hours of my evenings. It keeps me occupied in so many ways, and it's just the right amount of frustrating that it makes you want to keep coming back for more to get that next round right. So thanks everybody for watching, and have yourselves a great day.